So I'm going to be talking about frequency separation. And the reason I'm doing this is about 6 weeks ago, Adobe held the Adobe Max conference. And this guy did a series of presentations there, a guy named Earth Oliver, that he called Frequency Separation 2.0. And what he did looked pretty impressive. And so I mentioned that on one of our previous Sip and Shares, which caused Don to volunteer me to talk about frequency separation. And I said I would look into what he did to see if I could figure out if it was anything special. I have looked into what he did, and I've concluded that what he does is not anything special over what anyone else does. So I'm just going to talk about normal frequency separation and then show you what he did towards the end. But from what I've played with, it doesn't seem to be anything significantly different. So frequency separation. A couple of weeks ago, there was a different set of online Photoshop tutorials called the Photoshop Virtual Summit 2. And on day 5 of that conference, Lisa Carney made a presentation on frequency separation, and she did a really good job. I hope some of you were able to catch that. If not, well, you'll get my watered down version of it. And I've stolen via screen capture some of her slides since she did a good job of explaining this stuff. So what is frequency separation? This is a technique in Photoshop where you take your image and you decompose it into 2 separate layers. One that represents the colors and the tones, the brightness and darkness in an image, and the other that represents the fine details, things such as fine lines in skin or pores in skin, or it could be tracks in a sand dune, footprints in a sand dune. And the purpose of separating your image into these 2 separate components, the color you might call the low frequency, the fine details, the high frequency. The reason you do it is if you're doing retouching, it's not always easy to do cloning over things that you want to fix and get both the texture and the color or tones correct at the same time. But if you separate them, then you can work on one or the other independently, and it can make retouching a lot easier. And so how do we go about doing that? I guess this slide basically covers what I just said at the end of the previous one. So
Jeff, I'm not seeing anything on my screen.
Yeah.
I am.
I
am too.
Mine's working fine.
Yeah, it's working. But Jeff, it looks like there may be some dirt on your mouse eye or something. There's a circle around your mouth.
That's just a highlight.
That's just a highlight.
Oh, okay.
Photoshop, for some reason, is doing that. So Neil, I don't know how to fix your problem.
That is really weird.
I can see it fine.
Me too.
Yeah, I'm good.
I'm good too.
RGB.
Okay, so sorry, Neil. So let's go into how is it that you do frequency separation. And there is a recipe, a series of steps that are pretty easy to do, and you only have a couple of choices to make along the way. And so what frequency separation becomes, as I said, there are 2 layers we're going to end up with. One that represents the colors and tones, the other that represents the fine details. So over here, my mouse is going over what's called the low frequency layer, or often called the blur layer, where what we're going to do is blur out the image so that you no longer see that fine detail. And then we are going to take the original image and subtract out the blur leaving over here just the fine detail. If you squint at your screen, you might be able to see that on that patch of gray, there actually are some brighter and darker tones that represent the fine detail.
Right.
And so through various operations in Photoshop, we're going to create these two layers for you to work with, okay? And so here's what you do. The first thing you do is take your original background layer that I'm highlighting here and make two copies of it, one to be the blur layer or low frequency layer, the other to be the detail layer. And the blur layer, you apply a Gaussian blur to it, and we'll discuss what sort of radius of blur that you should use. And then on the second layer, we are going to use an operation in Photoshop called apply image to basically subtract that blur from the original image, leaving just the fine detail. And there are some options that you have to set in this apply image. You have to tell it which layer to subtract out. That's the blur layer. You tell it what operation you're going to do. In this case, it's subtract. And then there are some figures, some scale and offset that have to be set in order to tell Photoshop how to do the arithmetic correctly. And I'll point out that this information that you're seeing on this slide is correct for 8-bit images. If you're working with 16-bit images, then you have to actually make different choices in apply image. There is a checkbox over here called invert, which you need to check. Instead of subtracting, you actually do an add, and the offset, instead of being 128, becomes 0. What's nice is all of this can be condensed into an action, and I'll give you some references for some actions you can get that'll make all that work magically for you so you don't have to deal with it on your own. Okay, but let's go on and talk about the blur amount. So Lisa Carney does lots of retouching, and the way she talks about Photoshop is in terms of image size. And so when I get an image up here, I'll point out where you see that on the image. But her recommendations are for small images, 5 to 45 megabyte Photoshop files, you would use a blur of 5. For medium-sized images, 50 to 150 megabyte images, a blur of 7. And if you get bigger than that, you'll use a blur of 10. Now, in addition to standard retouching, say, of portraits, you can apply frequency separation to landscape images, which I'll show you a couple examples of. And in that case, the recommendations that I get via other people, via Sean Bagshaw, for those who know him, is if you're making an adjustment where you want to do a touch-up that corrects just color parts of the image. So for example, if you have image flare that's causing the color in a part of the image due to the flare to change, you get a highlight that's bright or yellow or something like that, then a blur amount of 10 is a reasonable amount to use. On the other hand, if you're correcting for texture, you might need to increase the blur amount. And what you want to do is increase the blur amount until the texture you want to correct disappears, which means that it will no longer be in the blur or low frequency layer. And so that might take you up to a blur amount of as high as 30. And we'll see this in a couple examples that I work through. Okay, so before we work on the examples, let's talk about tools that you're going to use to do your retouching. The blur layer, obvious from its name, is blurry. And so it's not critical, or actually probably not even desirable, to use tools that would preserve sharpness and pixels as they are. So choosing tools, such as are listed here on the left side of the screen, that blur the blur layer even more, or that, you know, smudge around the colors or the tones, are what you tend to use for it. So you can use the brush tool or the smudge tool. You can even use a gradient tool, and there's one called a blur tool that are useful. You can use the clone stamp, and I've used the clone stamp, and we'll show an example of that on the blur layer. But clone stamp preserves texture, so it's probably not the first thing you might choose to use on the blur layer. On the other hand, for the high frequency layer, which I'll typically call the detail layer, which Lisa Carney called the gray layer, you'll want to use tools that preserve that texture. So clone stamp, probably the most common one to use, but you might use the healing brush or the spot healing brush to work on that layer. In addition, there are, you can use filters to operate. So for example, you might use Gaussian blur, even though you created the blur layer with Gaussian blur, you might choose the Gaussian blur filter to blur other parts of the blur layer even more than it was originally. That would, say, even out tonality on skin that you would get in a portrait. Okay, another tool you might use is the dust and scratches filter, which comes from the set of noise filters in Photoshop. And this will, in addition, blur out detail in your image. So it can be applied to either the blur layer or to the detail or gray layer to, say, if you wanted to smooth out pores in skin texture, you could use something like this, the dust and scratches filter to do that. So that's the theory. Let's work through some examples and see how this actually works. So this is a landscape image that I got from one of Sean Bagshaw's videos. And in this particular image, you'll notice that there is lens flare over here on the side. And what I'd like to do is correct that lens flare. And you might notice that the detail, the trees on the hillside shine through or show through perfectly through the lens flare. It's really only affecting the color. It's made the hillside a little brighter. It's changed the tone from a dark green to a lighter green with a little bit of yellow in it. And we'd like to correct that. So how do we go about doing it? Here's my background layer. As I said, the first step is you make a couple of copies of the background layer. Easiest way to do that is keyboard shortcut, Control-J, Control-J. On a Mac, Command-J, Command-J. So now we've got two new layers. I'm gonna change the name of them so that we know what the layers are gonna do. The bottom one is the blur layer, and the top one will be the detail layer. And to tidy things up, what's useful to do is to put these two layers into a group, which I'm going to name FS for frequency separation, just so that we know that's what those two layers are about. Okay, I'm going to fix the name here. Okay, so we need to now create the frequency separation by creating a blur, okay, on the blur layer. To do that, you go to Filter and Blur, Gaussian Blur, and then it's up to us to choose the level for the Gaussian blur. And one thing that's convenient to do, I'm gonna stop this first of all, is turn off the visibility on the detail layer. That way, when we do the blur, we'll get to see the blur on the entire image instead of just the little preview that it shows us. So let's do that. Again, blur, Gaussian blur. And now we can decide what radius to do. Since I just wanted to work on this color change that was caused by the lens flare, I'm going to take a look at using a blur radius of 10. And so I'll click OK for that. And that creates my blur layer. Now we need to go and create the detail layer. And that's done by applying that apply image operation. Do that by coming up to image, selecting apply image. And if you notice up at the top of my Photoshop, this particular image is an 8-bit image. So we'll use the levels here for 8-bit. So we'll choose from the layer pull down that we want to use the blur layer. The operation we want to use out of all these options is subtract. And the scale is 2, the offset is 128. Since it's an 8-bit image, we don't invert. We click OK, and this looks funny. There's one more step we have to do. The detail layer is currently in normal blend mode, and what we'll need to do is change that to the linear light mode. And when I've done that, now it looks like the original image. And in fact, that's the way you check your frequency separation to make sure you've done these steps correctly, is if you turn off and turn on your frequency separation group, you should see no change to your image. And that's what we see. And so we know we're okay. So now we can go ahead and start doing the retouching through the frequency separation layers. But I'll give you one other thing that you might want to consider doing. And that is, instead of working directly on your original blur and detail layers, make copies of them so that you can see what work you've done. And if you make a mistake, you can get rid of it without having to redo the whole frequency separation once again. So I'll duplicate this blur layer with a Control J. And so this is going to be my working layer to operate on for the blur. And to do that for the detail, there's a couple extra steps we need to do. We first do a Control J to duplicate the layer. And if you were observant, you'll notice that the image got a whole lot crunchier. We've essentially doubled up on the image detail. And so there's a couple other things we have to do to account for that. The first thing you do is you have to link this working detail layer to the detail layer below it. You do it by holding down Alt or Option on a Mac, hovering between the two layers and clicking, and that then links the two layers, okay? In addition, that top layer, the working layer, we change the blend mode from linear light back to normal. And once we've done that, it makes no change. We've not doubled up on the detail. And so that gives us a couple of working layers to make any changes to. Okay, so as I said, for this particular image, the detail through that lens flare looks fine, but we want to fix the color. So I'm going to work on my blur copy layer, and I need to fix up this color. So I could do it in different ways. One particular way might say, let's use the clone stamp. So I'll click on the clone stamp. And if I take some color from the left side of the lens flare, hold down Alt to sample the color I want. And then if I paint over the lens flare, you'll notice that that lighter color is going away. And so I just keep painting over it. And once I fully covered it, it looks like it's fixed it. Here's a sample with the working layer turned off and with it back on. Okay, and so that fixes the lens flare and it kind of looks perfect. But there are different tools you could use. I'll make a different working layer. And so there's another tool that you find under the collection of tools that normally has the blur tool on top. It's called the smudge tool. And this just smudges color around from your image. So if I take some color from the left of this lens flare and smudge it in to the right over the lens flare, I will gradually cover up all of the lens flare. And if I want, I can come in from the other side too, if I find that's a better blend. And voila, there's another way of doing it. So you could use the smudge tool for the clone stamp, and they haven't produced identical results, but they've probably produced, you know, good enough results in both cases. Okay, in this particular instance, the detail, if I look at the detail here, I don't see any issues with any of my fixes messing up that detail. So I'm just gonna leave this as is, okay, and not use my detail copy layer. Okay, any questions about that up to this point?
So Jeff, you used a radius of 10.
Yes.
You know, if you wanted to just visually choose a radius, what you're saying is you basically want to start, say, at 0 on the blur layer, and you simply increase the radius until what you want to get rid of kind of blurs out. Is that
well
true?
What you want to make sure is on the detail layer, you make sure that you can no longer see that once you choose a blur radius high enough that you can no longer see everything that you want to be on the detail layer. And let me work one more example, and I think this example will help demonstrate some of that. So here's another Sean Bagshaw example, which shows some footprints in sand dunes. And what we want to do is we want to get rid of these footprints. To start that, I want to show you something though first. I made a duplicate layer just to work on. You use frequency separation when the retouching you want to do can't easily be done with other techniques. And so, for example, if I see these footprints on the sand dune, my first inclination would be, why don't we use content-aware fill and see if that will just fix it for us? Because if we do it, it's pretty quick and easy, right? So how would you use content-aware fill? Select the lasso tool, sort of select footprints that you want to get rid of. And then we do, let's see. I have to remember where content-aware fill is because I have a button
Edit,
in this.
I think.
Yeah,
Pardon me?
under edit.
Under edit, okay. Content-aware fill. Okay, so it's looking pretty good. Let me click OK and see how that looks. I'll get rid of this. So it's done a pretty good job. I can see a little bit of extra texture here that maybe wasn't there before.
That's it.
Okay, but it did a really good job. So in a situation like this, I might not bother with frequency separation because content-aware fill did such a good job. But to demonstrate frequency separation, I'm going to continue on with it. So I'm going to get rid of these two layers and we'll do our frequency separation. So we all remember the formula. Make two new layers. Call the bottom one blur, top one detail. We are going to put those into a group called FS for frequency separation. And I've got to blur the bottom layer. So let's hide the detail layer so we can see the blur a little bit better. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Okay, and so it's at 10. And as I look at 10, I can still see remnants of those footprints. So 10 isn't good enough. So let's increase it. There's 30, or well, it's 26. I still see a little bit. Let's come up to 33. Those are kind of gone now. How much farther down could I get? Here's 20. 20 doesn't look good enough. 30 is probably good enough. So I'm going to click OK for that. So does that sort of demonstrate what you were asking about, Paul?
It does.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's turn the detail back on. And if you look up at the top of this image, this is another 8-bit image. So we'll use the same formula as before. So image, apply image. We are going to, instead of from the merged layer, which is the default, we'll choose blur, subtract to 128, click OK. We are going to change the blending mode to linear light, turn off, turn on, looks good since there's no change. And now we can go about fixing the detail. So in this particular image, I'm not going to work on the blur layer. I mean, I could, for practice, make sure I have a working level for the blur layer, but it's the detail layer that I want to work on in this case. So I'll make a copy of that layer, a working copy. I will link it to the bottom layer and change the blending mode to normal. So now I can work on the detail copy. And I could use any sort of tool I want that I think is reasonable. I'm going to try clone stamping since that's, you know, usually a good way to go. So I sample over to the right and start painting over.
Okay.
And it's kind of like magic. It just kind of disappears. Okay. So that's done a pretty nice job of getting rid of those footprints. And if we continued, we could get rid of all the footprints in this image. Okay.
With the same adjustments?
Pardon me?
With the same adjustments?
With the exact same adjustments. In fact, you know, I would probably, since clone stamping is working well, I'd do the same. So sample over here and just stamp that all out.
So Jeff, do you want to comment if those sand dunes had ripples in them, how you would use the clone stamp tool to make sure that everything kind of all matches up and stuff?
Well, you know, I'd have to go about doing it. I mean, I took my own pictures in white sands, which did have ripples, and I attempted using frequency separation to get rid of some footprints in that, and I was having a difficult time doing it. So I don't know. I think I might end up doing a lot of sort of painful cloning in that case to deal with the ripples. Now, if you chose a blur that was sufficient that you might be able to, you know, separate your blur from your footprint detail, but I'd actually have to work on one, you know, seriously to try and figure that out, what works well. Have you tried it?
I have not. That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, so all I would suggest is give it a try and see what works, okay? Because every image is going to be a little bit different. Let's do another example, which is a portrait. And I don't know, maybe that will show enough other little techniques that it might give you some further ideas. So as it turns out, we did a lighting workshop a few years ago, and I had to resort to that to find actual portraits. I don't have portraits typically in my collection of pictures, but here is Anna Kelly from 3 years ago or so. And so I'm going to use her to demonstrate frequency separation. So we all know the formula, right? Okay. So I'm not going to go through the formula because there are actions you can download to do this for you. And I'll point out a couple. Where my mouse is right now, you see JM frequency separation under my actions panel. Those are actions that you can get from Jimmy McIntyre. They're okay, but they're maybe not as robust as some others you might find. There's one above it here called PM frequency separation. PM stands for Prince Mason, M-E-Y-S-O-N, who is a YouTube guy that offers these. And so I got his frequency separations, and his claim to fame, or his reason why he said he created these, is his actions, you can use them multiple times on the same image. Whereas with Jimmy McIntyre's, if you use them on the same image, they start getting intertwined with each other. The action is not smart enough to separate itself from each other. Whereas you can get the Peyton Mason or the Prince Mason's action to work okay. So I'm going to use his advanced action, select the action and press play. And it gives me now a choice of what blur amount I want to use. His default is 14. I'm going to go with the recommended value from that I gave you before, which was 10. Okay, so I'll select that. And here it's created my layers. And if you'll notice, the nice thing about the advanced action is it creates these working layers for us, the copies, so that, you know, I don't have to go and do those extra steps. In addition, this action was also smart enough to realize that I'm working on a 16-bit image. And so when it did the apply image step, instead of subtract, it used add. It used the offset of 0 instead of 128, and it checked the invert box. So it did all those things for us. Okay, so let's start applying this. So I'm going to come down to the frequency separation, the low frequency or the blur layer, and we'll do some operations. So what can you go about doing? Okay, you may notice there are some hot spots from our light. So on Anna's cheek, it's bright here and it's bright here on the forehead. And so I'd like to tone those down. Those are part of the color and tone. So I'm clearly going to be working on the blur or low frequency layer. And an interesting thing that you can do is I'll create a new layer that I'm going to call paint. And actually, that's not the way I want to create this layer. Let me delete it. Okay, I'll just create a new layer that I'll call paint. And the reason is one of the techniques that you can use is just applying paint onto your image. So if I select a paintbrush, that's history brush. Where's my paintbrush? Paintbrush. And I want to use, let's say, an opacity of around 50. You can, with an Alt, pressing down the Alt key, you can sample a tone that's a little bit darker than this bright spot. And we can just paint over the bright spot. That seemed maybe a little bit too dark. So I'll sample something that isn't quite as dark. And so you can get rid of bright spots by simply painting over them with skin tone that you sample from your image. So here's the paint layer. And if I don't like the amount of paint that I put on there, I can always come up to the opacity of this layer and reduce it a bit and blend that in. So you can fix some of the tonality with paint. Here's another way that you can fix some of that tonality is you can take your lasso and choose an area that you want to smooth out the tones in. So I'm gonna go down into Anna's neck here and select this area. And then what I'm gonna do is create a new layer from that selection. And the reason I do that will become apparent soon is I can then take a filter and apply Gaussian blur to this. And let's find this in the image. Okay, and we choose an amount of blur that is going to even out the tones in this section of the image. So let's say something like 23. I click OK, and what this does is it evens out the tones and it just smooths things out in general. Okay, I created this separate layer for a reason. One is if I don't like what that particular correction did, then I can delete it and start over again. The alternative is you could take this, you could work directly on your working layer, say, and you could make a selection. So I sort of missed a little bit over here. And I could do the blur directly on this working layer, but then it's harder to undo things later on. The other thing you have to be aware of is when I make a selection, by default, there is no feathering of the selection. And any retouching I want to do, I want to make sure that I do some feathering. Well, when I put this onto a separate layer and I did a blur of 23 pixel radius, it basically feathered it by 23. So I got some feathering built into it. If I'm going to do this operation on this layer directly, I'd better take my feather amount and increase it to some reasonable amount so that it blends in nice and smoothly. But then I can just go and do blur, Gaussian blur, choose that blur, and let's see, where's my history? So I can see what effect this had by turning the working layer on and off. It blurs it a little bit, but you'll notice it doesn't blur it completely because there's still texture, fine texture in it, where we're going to have to work on the texture layer to correct that. Okay, let's do a few other of these. Once I've done this layer and I like it, I can merge that layer down. So let's see. We can say merge down. And that way I don't collect a whole bunch of extra layers that I don't need. I can keep merging them down to clean things up. And I can do the same thing with this paint option. Let's merge that down. Okay, that just cleans things up a little bit in my working space. Okay, let's do a few other selections. Let's work on the cheek over here. I'll create a new layer and I'm going to filter And notice the last filter you used shows up at the top, so I can just select Gaussian blur. Uses the same radius I used before. And that just smooths out some of the different tonalities. We can do a similar thing over here. Okay, filter, Gaussian blur. Okay, well, in that case, I forgot to. I should be working down here to do that. Create a new layer. And on the new layer, let's see, do my filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Okay, 23 pixels is probably good. And so you can see the effect of that. So all of these operations on the color and tone are meant to just smooth out the tones. All right. To get fine lines, those we have to work on the high frequency layer. So let's move to that layer. And we're going to work on these lines. And I'll use the clone stamp, say, to work on those. So I'll take the clone stamp and sample here. And one thing you need to check when you're going to work on with the clone stamp is the normal setting up here is current layers and below, or maybe in your Photoshop, it might be all layers. You do not want that. You need to go up here and make sure if you're going to clone stamp, you're working only on the current layer. Otherwise, it's going to intermix the blur layer with the high frequency layer, and you won't be doing the frequency separation that you wanted. So let's sample and paint over some of these lines. Okay, so on and off shows the effect. If you think that your operation has gone too far, maybe you don't want to make someone look 20 years old. You want to actually keep the way they normally look, but just a little bit refreshed. You can bring down the opacity, and that way it shows through a little bit. So that's the way you go about doing retouching on the high frequency layer. And what I would do is I would continue on with, the rest of the image, sampling various places and painting over lines that I want to eliminate.
So you follow that line as much as possible then?
Yeah, you don't want to clone over places you're not intending to clone. You want to do as little work as possible. But it's, really easy to go over any place you want. And so I said there was a place down here that I didn't quite get because there's these come from the high frequency layer. So you just come down here and sample and clone. Okay. Okay. I can actually see a little line from where maybe I didn't feather that one of those selections well enough. So that's something that you'd have to come back to this area. And in this case, maybe cloning. Well, I'm not getting the tone right, so that's not going to work too well. Maybe if I go closer. Yeah. Maybe in this case, using the healing brush would work a little bit better because it'll get. Okay, we have to set a sample. Ah, look what I did. Sample all layers. Okay, we don't want to do that. So. Okay. So it's fixing it up a little bit, but I might actually have to go back into this and do some more work on blending out any of the mistakes that I did. So maybe lassoing this, creating a new layer. Let's do filter, blur. And that helps. It blurred a little bit into her shirt, but no problem. We can add a mask to that layer, choose a brush, paint with black paint, and any of the blurring that I went over the lines with, I can just paint out. I think I need a little higher opacity to do that. Okay. So I can fix that. Let's take a look at a couple other things we can do. You can apply filters. Let's make a new working layer here. Okay, this is the high frequency area. You can apply a filter to this whole thing. One of the filters recommended was dust and scratches. And so you need to, what this does is this is a noise filter and it kind of blurs things out. So you can choose some settings. So like about 20 and 2 might be a good setting. Okay. And let's try that. And what this does is it blurs things out. We don't want the whole portrait to be blurry. So if I create a black mask on this layer, I just hold down Alt and click the Add a Layer Mask. Then what I can do is with a white brush, I can paint this in. I'm going to choose an opacity that's maybe start in the 50-ish range. I can start painting that blur in areas of the image that I'd like to soften detail in. And so,
Jeff, is that similar to Clarify or whatever it's called?
It's sort of the, I would think the opposite of Clarify in that I'm painting blur in to remove lines. So I don't know how well this is showing up on your screen, but
Good.
it's removing a lot of that, the lines, and I can then take this layer, adjust the opacity, you know, if I want more or less, and it just gives me a way to soften the details. So, you know, that's how to apply a filter. And if I like that and everything's good, I could merge that layer down to avoid having tons and tons of layers in here. But those are the basic operations that you can use for doing this frequency separation. Okay. There are a few other examples that I'll show since Lisa Carney did them in her presentation. So for example, you might use frequency separation to adjust skin tones. This would be on the blur layer. You could get rid of tan lines such as this. Take a look at this. She said in the olden days, this was just torture to retouch because you've got all this fine detail from these stockings where you've got some bruises and other things on the leg that you want to correct. Well, with frequency separation, you essentially separate the stocking from the tones and the colors in the legs, and you can work on them independently, and you don't have to worry about getting all the texture in the stocking right. Okay, here's another example. In a product shot, let's say you wanted to get rid of all this little detail in here. Well, you can separate your tones and your detail, get rid of the speckles from cinnamon in this particular drink. With the detail layer, you can use the blur layer to get rid of the reflection of the light that this was lit with. If you wanted to smooth out the shadows and the texture in this, you can actually do that with that painting technique by just painting over in white on top of these details, and you get something that looks like this. Okay. And this final example that I'll show, these are the examples, things that Earth Oliver did in his particular demonstration. Whereas he took, you know, skin retouching and did skin retouching. He took a sample of cloth and to get rid of the wrinkles in the cloth, he just went onto the blur layer and then essentially blurred that out. The particular tool he used was called the mixer brush, which is a way of taking colors from your image and blending them in with other colors in your image. And so he just blurred over that, and that created this nice clean image. He did the same thing over here where there are these dimples in this shoe, and the dimples all go away, but you maintain the little texture of the, whatever these dots are in here. And then he got rid of reflections in here. And he had his own techniques for doing that. And I'll go, let's see, back to one of our images here, say, and let me get rid of a bunch of layers so that I can show you what his action looks like. Okay, so I've just gotten rid of all the work we've done in the frequency separation here. And he offered an action, which I downloaded. Okay, so his action is, where did it go? Looks like it disappeared on me, but I can find it again. Okay, so this was his action. He offered it as an ATN tool, which you double click, and let's see, it should come up in my action panel. Okay, so here it is. He calls it Frequency Separation Tools 2.0. And I'll just run his action, okay, to show you what it looks like. And for his frequency separation, instead of using Gaussian blur, he uses a different blurring filter in Photoshop, which is called the median filter. And he, you know, gives you a choice. You can choose how much blurring you want to do. 6 doesn't look like it's doing very much. I'll use 10. I'll click OK. And it runs again. We click it again. And so here we get, let's see, his layer stack. So he's got his median filters, which is his blur layer, and he has a copy of it, his low, he calls it low frequency working layer. And then he has a high frequency working layer. He has, so the basic difference in his technique versus the technique from Lisa Carney that I showed you is instead of using Gaussian blur, he uses a median filter. And I guess he likes median filter better. Other people use median filters. There's another filter called a surface blur that apparently other people use as well. But I couldn't really discern any advantage to using the median filter and using his action over using the other actions, which are the standard way of doing it. So I just wanted to show you what it was, since it's sort of what inspired this whole thing in the first place. But like I said, I didn't find any real reason for needing to use it. So that is my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions people have.
That's fabulous. That solves a lot of problems I've been having.
Oh, good.
Great job. Great job, Jeff. Couple of comments. I really like the idea of duplicating the layers. That's something I don't do, but I can certainly see a good reason for doing that. The other thing, just personal preference, but I generally call what you refer to as the blur or low frequency. I usually name that color, and the detail one I usually rename texture. Just helps keep them straight in my mind anyway.
Yeah, so you should, choose whatever names you like. If you find someone's action to use, then, of course, you'll end up using whatever names they chose. But that sort of reminds me, I'll point out one thing. Neil, since you have the Tony Kuiper panel,
I think
there is in the Tony Kuiper panel a frequency separation action that you can run. So I'll run that here. 10 is the default. We'll stick with that for the blur. Okay, and so here is the resulting frequency. He calls it color, blur, and texture. So that's good. But when I turn this on and off, I see a slight change in the image. It's really subtle, but I see a change in the image, and I don't know why that is, other than I watched one of these old Sean Bagshaw videos where he was explaining one of the older versions of the Tony Kuiper panel, and he was explaining frequency separation. And he walked through the steps to do frequency separation. And he said, after you create the color blur layer and the texture layer, he put in an additional layer, which was either a curves or a levels layer. And he adjusted the brightness slightly because apparently at that time, 5 or 6 years ago, when you did these operations in Photoshop, apparently the linear light blending mode or whatever did not get these to blend perfectly. And there was this change in brightness. And so in Tony Kuiper's action, he corrected the brightness with this extra layer. And so I wonder if Tony Kuiper still has his action back from the old days, and he's got that extra adjustment to tonality, brightness in there. But once I started noticing that, which I did in preparation for doing this presentation, I think I'm no longer going to use Tony Kuiper's action because I see that slight difference.
So Jeff,
you can
does
create your
Tony...
own action. So you create your own action and just add it to the Tony Kuiper panel.
Yeah, you can do that. In fact, if I saw any value in using Earth Oliver's action, I could just do that. Or I could just take, the PM advanced action, which I tend to like because it creates those extra layers. I could stick that in here as well, yeah.
So do you know, does Tony Kuiper differentiate between 8-bit and 16-bit, Jeff?
Oh, his works correctly for 8 bits and 16 bits.
Okay.
Yeah.